So here's an in-progress video of putting LEDs and stuff in my 94 Rx7 FD. I had a LED conversion done in my Supra. There's a guy named Stu Hagen that does it, and he does a really nice job. But unfortunately, he only works on Supras, so I'm doing this on my Rx7 myself. I found some stuff online. Other people have done similar things. So I'm just giving it a go. This was my stock gauge cluster, and I've gone ahead and I've kind of hollowed out the back of it. I took the gauges out. There are a few stands and stuff, like right here and right here, that I had to grind off. All the factory stuff still on the back. I'll still be using that for the turn signals and probably some of the warning lights down here. All of the gauges and stuff, they just unbolt. My factory cluster didn't really work anyway, so I didn't feel too bad about hacking it up. These are Speedhut gauges, and this is a 4.5 inch tachometer. This is a 4-inch speedometer, and I've got a fuel, oil pressure, and coolant temp. I have to send the oil pressure and coolant temp back to them. The little button on them is broken. There's my factory lens. You can see right here there's a red button, and on the gauges are these rubber things, and these little pedestals go on the back of them. When you push them, it'll push this pedestal down onto the button. For some reason, 2 of those red buttons are snapped off halfway, so the pedestal doesn't really reach it. It wants to wobble around. You can't really click it. When the gauges come, they're going to have this glass thing on the front of them and a ring. You can take that right off. And then to keep the glass centered, I guess you can kind of see it. See how there's a little indentation here and here on the lens? There'll be a little plastic ketone on 2 sides that kind of centers the glass. You don't want that, so you want to chop that off with a razor blade. And this is the factory bezel, and I've enlarged the holes. And you don't want to just take the holes where they are and enlarge them right in the center. You can see that this one I've kind of chewed away more here than here, because you want the gauges to be center. You want it so that when you stick the factory lens on it, that the ring that you see around it will be centered. And if you just take the holes where they are and enlarge them, you'll have some gauges that are a little offset. So it's just a matter of grinding them out so that you can get it centered. And then once you have it fit where it needs to go, I'm just using a little dab of hot glue on the back. I'm not using the locking rings because they won't fit, but just a dab of hot glue to kind of hold them, get them centered. And then I'm going to go back through once I've got everything how I want it, and I'm going to use some really good quality high heat hot glue. I forget where I bought it. I bought it probably 10 years ago, and I've used it on dashes where they start to peel up, and it works really well. So I'm just going to put a little kind of like a weld, but with hot glue just around the gauges to hold them in. You probably wouldn't want to use normal hot glue because when the car heats up in the sun, it may want to melt or run or not hold. But this high heat stuff that I have, I know will work. So that'll keep those secure. You no longer use the factory or the Speedhut lens and the collars on them. So you take that off. And then you're going to take your lens and you'll put your lens over it. And you're going to have to drill holes for the button. So you want to kind of put it where it needs to be. Make sure it doesn't move. You can actually screw it back onto this bezel if you want. There's a screw hole here and a screw hole there. So that'll be perfectly stable. And you want to look down over the gauge and you'll be able to see where the button is. And you can take a fine tip Sharpie and just put a little dot where you need to drill. And then you're going to have to drill a hole, use a small pilot bit, and just keep enlarging it until it's the same size as the hole that's on the clear lens. And then afterwards, you want to clean this off really well. You'll be able to take the little rubber things that come with the Speedhut gauges, and you'll be able to push them through the holes. You'll be able to put the pedestals behind them and snap this down. And it's not gonna snap down like you think, because even though this fits up tight against it, it's not gonna click on all the way. The surface of the Speedhut gauges is gonna force the plastic away from it some, and there's not a whole lot that you can do about that. You could try to hack up this black piece even more and maybe plastic weld some stuff in. I thought about trying to design something to 3D print, but this would be the most complicated object that I've ever designed, so I'm just leaving it like this. Other people have left it like this and it's been fine. So you will have those two screws that are pretty much holding it together. I was experimenting up here, and you can see that where these snaps are, because they're not going to go through enough to snap to this edge. Over here I cut some away, so I mean I can get that in enough to kind of snap, but it still doesn't want to catch as well as you'd think, because this is kind of away from it. This part that I cut kind of angles, so it doesn't catch that tab. Maybe you could heat up the plastic ear and kind of bend it out so it would want to put more pressure against this. I don't know if I'll try that or not. I don't want to risk breaking it. I am going to order another plastic just to have. I figure I might as well while they're still available from Mazda. And then afterwards, once you've got everything secured, you'll feed the wires through some of these holes. I don't know if I'll have to open them up a little for the connectors to go through, and that'll be your cluster. And what I'll probably do for this edge, because it doesn't snap together, I don't know if I'll put a dab of glue or I'll put maybe I'll glue a piece of felt or something along the top, something that kind of overhangs, just so no dust is going to be able to fall down there and get on the gauge. So I haven't quite got that far. That's why it's an in-progress video. I'll go back over it once I get everything finalized. And then this is the climate control. And I got to be extremely careful with this because it's the 94, it's the textured finish. They're hard to find in good shape. But you can take everything apart. And I've never done it before, but if you're careful, it kind of makes sense. This back part will unscrew, and you still can't pull it off because the dials actually stick through the face, and there's these nuts and washers on it. So you have to remove all these nuts and washers around all of the dials. Then you'll be able to pull this back off, and you got to be careful because some of the wires attach to these buttons, and those buttons screw to the back side of this. So just pull it apart carefully, take the screws out. I did undo a few connectors at first. You could unplug it or take the screws out, I guess. So all that is out, and then this is probably the hardest part. This screws onto the back of this, obviously, and this has some like glue. I don't know if it was glued as well or if it just runs off from when these were glued in. But I had to pry on this quite hard, and I was real careful, and you want to pay extra close attention to right here, because when you're trying to pry that out, it's going to want to bend this middle part out, and you can see how fragile that is. You can kind of push with your fingers in between this ridge to push this out. So now that these are out, these connectors, or not connectors, but these inserts come out, and you can see that this is glued on there. And because I'm doing LED, I'm doing a white LED. If you shine like a flashlight through the back of this, it's got to light up yellow. These factory gauges kind of have like a yellowish hint to them. So you don't want to just put LED bulbs in because it's not going to look right. These replacements are from Black Cat Customs, and they've got a 3M tape on the back, so I can't really hold them up to the light yet. But you can have them tinted different colors, or you can ask for clear. So I asked for clear, so that should allow the LEDs to shine through correctly. And one other thing I forgot to mention with these Speedhuts, speaking of LEDs, Speedhut, the gauges that they sell currently have this luminescent, can't even say the word, some like L-glow panel behind, kind of like the eBay gauge faces that you get. And I bought the white ones, and they didn't really light up white. One of them kind of looked white, the other had like a greenish hue to them. So I wasn't happy. I contacted them, and they said they are going to be doing LEDs in the future, and they actually make gauges for Holley. Holley EFI sells some gauges that look really cool. They're made by Speedhut, and in those gauges, Speedhut actually uses LEDs. So they let me send these back, and they converted them to LEDs, and they light up like the perfect white. They look a million times better than the old like panel that they had with the L-glow, Indiglow stuff for a backlighting. So they're nice enough to do that, and they just look really sweet with the LEDs. So this will be LED, and then I'm going to have LEDs behind here, hopefully, and everything will look well. And I saw one guy online to try to get the most glow you can. You can see there's only 2 bulbs per dial. He glued these little mirrors around here, like these little round mirrors that you'd get at a craft store. I don't know if I'll try some kind of foil tape, or I may just spray paint it, clean it real well with some like chrome paint, just to try to help distribute the light a little bit better. But I'll see what works. So here is another partway through video. I'm still waiting on the 2 gauges from Speedhut. Those should be here tomorrow. I got the Black Cat custom overlays installed, and those look really nice. Those seem to work really well. And the old material that I had to pull off, this was a pain to remove. This peeled off easily, but it leaves a lot of sticky residue behind, and that took me a while to remove. I didn't want to harm the plastic. I ended up using some mineral spirits that I kind of sprayed with some water afterwards to get it off. That seemed to work best. So you don't need this anymore. When you apply the new Black Cat custom labels, you can see this has retained the shape. It's like a cone. What I did on the back of it, because it's an adhesive, it's like a 3M adhesive, it's got the paper backing, is I took a razor blade and I cut through the paper backing here and here, so on each side of the button that goes to the feet, and then I peeled off that paper so that it was just sticky on the top and I wouldn't have to worry about either side catching. And then I focused right on the top, and I made sure that I got that lined up where it needed to be. And then after the top was stuck, I could kind of press down the sides with the paper still there to make sure that as that pressed down and kind of curved into the cone, it was where I wanted it to be. And then afterwards, I was able to lift up one side, pull that paper off, and then work it down. And then I repeated the same for the other side. That seemed to work well. This label is just a flat piece. There's no curve to it. And that's just peel the entire thing off and line it up as best as you can. And you can see it looks really good. All the spacing and everything, I'm happy with it. So let's talk about lighting next. So I don't like bright lights at night. Why am I doing LEDs? The Rx7 factory cluster and climate thing is not bright at all. Like it's too dim for me, and that's saying something. So I got everything hooked up, and what I found, mainly on the climate control, there's 2 different size bulbs that I've been using. I've been using these smaller ones for the buttons, and then there's these larger ones for the main 4 lights for each knob here. And what I found with the factory dimmer rheostat thing, all the way up, the brightness for these buttons or these dials was too bright for me. It was glaring. But the buttons, the smaller LEDs for this stuff, like the hazard, the recirculating, and the AC, those look great with the dimmer all the way up. And then when I turn the dimmer down, these looked less great, but this was still still fairly bright. So I want to find a way to dim these lights but keep the buttons where they are. And what I discovered is I thought this was going to be some kind of resistor, variable resistor, but it actually uses pulse width modulation. So instead of acting like a resistor, it's a square wave, a square DC wave, and it's constantly flashing those LEDs on, off, on, off, on, off, being on longer when it's brighter, being on shorter when it's all the way dim. So I'm not really able to control that, so that's going to have to stay where it is. But I am able to control the path going to the 4 bulbs that are behind here. And I've got it lit up right now, but my shop lights are kind of masking it. But there's 4 bulbs that go behind there, and they all plug into this circuit. And this is on, I forget if it's on this knob or this one. It goes behind one of them. But if you followed the traces, I think there's 8 solder joints here. 4 of them are power to the bulbs, 4 of them are the ground. And if you follow these through, the left 4 go to this trace and the right 4 go to this trace. So power is on this side. So what I'm going to do is that circuit trace that's on this board, I don't know if you can see it, and I'm going to take like a Dremel and I'm going to cut this trace. And by cutting that trace, I'm going to be able to then jump it with a resistor, and that's going to take down the voltage just for the 4 bulbs that are too bright. And I've been messing around with it. I've got a breadboard there. I ordered a bunch of resistors because I wasn't sure what I needed, and it was only $10 for all of these resistors. And I think I settled on where I'm happy is a 270 ohm, and that makes these lights a lot less bright where I want them. The other thing, as far as light distribution, I found that this label, what is that, defrost, isn't as bright as the rest of them. And I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at one of these LEDs that goes in there, it's got one on the top, and then it's got one on this side, and it's got one on this side. And they're supposed to be 360 degrees. But when you stick that bulb socket in there and turn it, neither of these side LEDs are pointed over here. I think they're kind of pointed like this. So the light wants to go this way, and the light wants to go this way. And the top of that bulb is right where my finger is, right here. So if you put that in and then turn the socket to where it clicks, it's not shining as much light over here. But if you then start to turn it back to loosen it, but not all the way, you can actually get it where the side LED points right down here, and that makes this a lot brighter. So that's what I'm going to do. I may put a dab of hot glue on the socket. It's still secure and tight, but I don't want it to loosen up or fall out. Another thing I may try to do is put a little mirror behind here, or some reflective tape just behind this defrost button. But aside from that, this seems to light up and distribute the light perfectly. The rest of this looks pretty good. The other kind of thing that I'm dealing with is the knobs, and these side knobs are fine. This is like a white clear thing that'll capture some light. I'm happy with that. What I'm not sure what to do with is this. And this is scratched up. I plan on ordering a new one. But if you look on the back of it, the actual plastic itself is tinted red. It's not a coating like the entire material. It's got this red tint. So it makes this fan and this little line here show kind of orange. And I'm not going for that look. So what I'm probably going to do is try to get it not to light up at all. I'm going to take some black spray paint and spray paint the back side of it to try to block all the light, and it just won't light up. Maybe the light from these dials will somehow reflect on it, but I think that'll look better than having this all white and look nice, and then having this old school orange for the fan. Maybe there's another button out there that or dial that I could switch it to. Maybe different years have a different kind of plastic. I don't know. If you know, let me know. So that's the climate thing. And now back to the cluster. This lights up, and the brightness it's not bad. I think it's a hair too bright for me, and they don't send you a dimmer for this. They say that the LEDs don't dim. Well, they can dim with a resistor. It's this white wire, and I've tested like a 50 ohms, 100 ohms, and I'm not sure where I want it, but I know 300 ohms makes it too dim. So what I'm probably going to do is just take this variable resistor. This is 0 to 200 ohms, and I'll wire that in so that I can adjust it to where I want it once it's installed in the car. So I run one of these on my Supra as well to dim Stu's cluster. So 0 to 200 ohms, this will go somewhere underneath the dash, and I can put it where I want. Maybe it's 50 ohms, maybe it's 60 ohms, somewhere around there. And I can dial down the brightness. So that's everything where it is. I've figured out what I need for all the brightness, where I need resistors. So I'm going to get that done. So it's all together. All the buttons and stuff work when you press them. This is how I tried to put it in behind the cluster hood, and it would work. I'm just not 100% happy with it, so I'm going to take another shot at doing something to get this clear lens to sit perfectly flush. And the reason I'm not happy with it is I knew there'd be a gap all around it, but what happens is the gap in the center is bigger. So this gauge bottoms out behind the cluster hood, and then this stuff sits back a little. And if you looked down at the cluster, you can actually see a gap between the cluster hood and where this side plastic is. And you can't pop this side plastic out more because then these buttons wouldn't work. Maybe you could pull the gauges out some so you get kind of the same equal gap. But you can see that there's not really a gap on the edges, or at least this edge is a big gap in the center, and there is a gap over here. It's just not as bad as this. So I'm going to take another stab at it. I'm going to try to do something to recess those gauges where this clear plastic can sit flush. Hopefully I won't screw it up beyond being usable. And one thing I wanted to point out, in case you're happy with this and this is how you wanted to do it, where I cut this plastic so that these tabs would snap in. Fortunately, I didn't do it for all the snaps, just 4 of them. I took a heat gun and I heated up the black part so I could push it in with my finger, and that allowed the snap to actually grab something. So I don't even have the side screws in right now, and I can lift it right up by the plastic. Oh no, I guess I do have them in, but it's solid, trust me. So next video will hopefully show what I did, and hopefully I'll be happy with how it looks. So this is where we're at now. I'm very happy with the way it came out. I'm glad I decided to do that. So what I did is I traced around all of the gauges how I had them before, and then I enlarged all the openings so that the gauges would sit flush. I'd be able to stick them in there where they need to be. And I lined them up, and then I took hot glue and I just put a few dabs around each gauge just to hold them where they needed to be. Then I test fit my cover. It fits on there perfectly. It didn't interfere with anything. All the buttons worked. So then I went around to the back side and I hot glued these in. And this is using some high heat hot glue. I think it's got a softening temperature of 230 degrees or so, because it can get upwards of 150, 170 degrees in a car if it's like 100 out and you park it in the sun. And I've used this on other stuff, so I know it'll hold up. I glued all those in, and then I came around to the front and then I pulled off all the little tacks that I had on there of hot glue. And when I did the front, I just used normal hot glue that comes off a lot easier than this high heat stuff. And then I still had some gaps around the gauges. I mean, they're not precisely cut holes. There are still some openings, and it'd probably be fine just to leave them as is, because these have black rings around them, and it hides everything. And there's not really any light behind here that could shine through. But for peace of mind, I added some black RTV around every gauge. I was careful to apply it so I didn't drip down any into on the face of the gauges. And then I smoothed it out with my finger, and then I used a little bit of this prep ball wax and grease remover on a paper towel, and I slowly wiped the edges clean. So the only RTV that's really on the gauges is between that opening. And then when you put this on, I still gotta clean it up, get all the dust and stuff off the backside. But none of that, what I did, will be visible. It'll snap on fully. I won't have the big gap here where dust and stuff can get in. And it should fit the gauge hood cover thing just like it did from the factory. All right, it's all back together now, and I've got the plastic on. I blew it off with an air compressor. I took a vacuum to it, trying to get it as clean as possible. I do still plan on ordering a new piece of plastic just to have as a spare, and if I ever have this apart for some other reason, I'll probably put it on. I like how I have the black rings here versus the silver. It didn't come like this. I spent a lot of time polishing off the silver paint on these because it was kind of faded and chipped in places. But it looks pretty good. You can see what I mean about getting the gauges centered. If you look at the black ring inside here, how it's kind of symmetrical all the way around. It's not off to one side really. The talk, you see more of it up top and the bottom and less on the side. I think it's because the factory gauge here is kind of not a perfect circle. It's kind of squished a little. And then here I've got the nice even uniform ring all the way around. All the buttons work. I don't have that big gap on the side. I do have the areas that I modified, but fortunately I only did 4 of them, so that's not too bad. And then here, you flip this around. Here's how I kind of routed stuff right out through the light bulb holes. This is the speedometer, this is the talk and one of the gauges, and then these are 2 of the side gauges. So this will all get wired up outside the cluster. This paper will stay on. I need it for the turn signals and probably some of these indicator bulbs. I'm gonna check what they are, because if I have something for like ABS or something, I'm gonna remove it because I did the ABS delete. So now I'm gonna go over the wiring and how I did it. My goal was to make it as integrated as possible. I didn't want to have a dozen different connectors behind the gauge cluster. I wanted as few as possible. So I'm still gonna have the OEM connectors, but I've only got 2 additional ones, and one's for oil pressure and one is for coolant temp. And I can live with that. Everything else I was able to tie into this board paper just by using some solder. If you recall, I also had some other wiring coming out here for like the power and ground and illumination wire for the gauges. It was kind of daisy chained, went from one gauge to another to another. I've managed to tuck that behind all the gauges. There was plenty of room, so all of those connectors are inside the cluster, and then I've got the 3 wires coming out. And there's also this long pink wire that was in the way the whole time, and I thought I needed it. And it turns out that's for cruise control input, And I do not have cruise control, so I was able to cut that wire and get that right out of the way. So I'm going to cover the areas that I tied into. These are for ground, and there's actually 3 ground wires I needed to hook up. So one's hooked up here, one's hooked up here, and then I ended up splicing into the ground wire here, just because I didn't want to have a ton of different solder joints for ground. These are existing solder joints that I reuse. I think if I tried to put 2 wires going to it, it may have caused problems, or I may not have been able to kind of keep them pinned down while the solder joint hardened. Moving over, this is the speedometer wire, and I tied into this trace. It's the second pin, and it comes up and it goes way over here, and the traces get really small, and it's not plugged into anything anymore because the factory gauges are removed. So what I did is I took a razor blade and I scraped the coating off this thick part of the trace, and then I added a little bit of flux, and I added a ball of solder to it, and it stuck right to it. Then I tinned the end of the wire, and I put a piece of tape over it to kind of hold the wire right over the ball of solder joint. And then I just took the solder gun, I put it on the wire, and it just kind of pushed down and melted in. So that seemed to work. I had to do the same thing over here for the tachometer wire. Now both of these, the speedometer and tachometer, do need pull-up resistors. It's taking the signal from the factory ECU. I do have a resistor over here. It's tied to that ignition. That's for the speedometer pull-up. The tachometer, I do not have a pull-up resistor on this gauge cluster, and that's only because over in my passenger footwell, when I did the LS2 swap, I put a pull-up resistor over there. So I've got one there, I don't need one here, so the gauge wired directly to here. It would have been cleaner if I could have had both pull-up resistors on here, but I can live with it. And then the speedometer wire that I do have the pull-up resistor on, that goes to my digital decoder box, which is also over in the passenger footwell area. And I'm going to end up removing that because the Speedhut gauge can do all that signal manipulation to get the speedometer right. So I'm going to take the input and output wires of the digital decoder box in my passenger footwell area, and I'm just going to tie those together, remove the box, and I'll adjust everything from right here. So then moving on, I said this was the ignition. That red wire coming out of there is power to the gauges. And then if we come down here, that white wire, that's for the fuel level. That's where the sensor is. If you followed this trace along the board, it goes to this pin. So instead of tying into the connector and the wire harness behind the cluster, I got it soldered on right there. And then the other wire for the fuel thing was one of these grounds over here. And then last is right here, that's for illumination. And I had to use a razor blade to scrape away that solder as well. I originally had it tied onto here, which was a poor idea because it's only secure on one side of the paper. There's not paper all the way around it. And there's no bulb here anymore. I forget what it was, but it's not needed. So I moved it here, and the reason that pulled out is because I got my variable resistor that's going to hang down, and I'm going to zip tie it to something under the dash. So if I want to make my gauges a little bit dimmer, I can. This got caught on something when I was testing it, and it tore that wire right out of there. So I had to move it up here. And because I had that experience, I decided when I cleaned up the wiring, I was going to make sure there's no stress on any wire that goes to the paper. And that's why I got this hot glue all over the place. And partway through, I did a little test where I actually put a dab there, let it harden, and I pulled it off, and it will remove the paper. So you want to be careful where you put it. You probably don't want to put it above any trace. So I tried to hit the plastic in between whenever I could. Here. And I got some on this paper, but that should be pretty secure. And then for the thing that got snagged last time, I did it right on these bulb sockets because I'm not using these bulbs anymore. I actually pulled the bulbs. This one is ABS. I forget what this one is, but that'll keep it secure if happens to get snagged. I'm going to be extremely careful with it anyways, but that's it. That's the wiring. I've tested it, so I'm going to go get this installed now. So everything is all installed and it seems to work. Just going to go over the sensors quickly before showing you the cluster. That's where I put the coolant temp sensor, and the wire is going to run behind the motor. And then over here, this is where the oil pressure sensor is, and I've got an AN line that kind of loops around, and I'm going to zip tie it to that bracket. That's where I had the stock sensor zip tied to. And that wire goes through, it meets up with the coolant one. They go through the inner fender, they come out behind the splash shield, and they poke through the grommet going to the inside. So this is the cluster. And then that's the climate control. If I turn the lights on, hopefully that's showing up well. They look even better in person. I know my camera doesn't capture stuff the greatest. Let's off, on. And I'm going to do one more test with some lights off. And that's how it looks. And they look really good in person. So the fuel gauge is calibrated. I did the 0 to 90 ohm setting. That's not perfect, but in the summer there's a way to calibrate it with min and max. I think it's like 5 ohms and 80 ohms or something like that. And the tachometer I've calibrated. The speedometer I need to calibrate. But I need to be able to drive the car to do that. So let me hop in. So overall impressions, very happy. The LEDs look great as well. I wish I could get this fan knob to light up white and not orange. So I've got that blacked out from behind. But that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.